is called a culture. If you have yogurt or kefir or other things like this that has, we call them live cultures, which means there's something growing in your food, right? In your yogurt or
Like
whatever that might be.
probiotics or something?
Probiotics, there you go.
Yeah.
And the idea there is that they're, positive bio ingredients, right? The things that are growing, right? So you can use a culture to create sourdough bread, for example, right? So it's a kind of thing that's takes on a life of its own. But I would say like culture, we talked about it's a combination of what you allow and what you create. But I would add to it that idea that culture is something that grows. What that means is that culture also takes on a life of its own.
Hey, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. Great to have you with us once again this week. I'm here with Pastor Nick Cady. He's the pastor of Whitefields Community Church here in Longmont, Colorado. And this is the first Sermon Extra of the year 2023. And we began this year on January 1st, our very first service of this year. And our subject and the title of the sermon was Full of Grace and Truth from John chapter 1, verse 14. And if you were not with us on Sunday morning, you can get over to whitefieldschurch.com and you can download the sermon there, or any of your favorite streaming platforms, YouTube, Facebook, and Apple and Google and all those fun ones. And if you would, you're watching this maybe on YouTube, just, hit the like button, subscribe, interact with it. If, rate and review if you can on some of the other platforms. It just really helps boost this content in cyberspace. And when people are just on Google looking for things, grace, they're looking for typing about truth or whatever, we pop up in their feed and we can provide them with Christ-centered and gospel-centered answers to their questions. And that's kind of what a little bit what your message was focused on Sunday was gospel, creating a gospel culture within the church. So we just kind of wanted to talk about some of those things. A lot of great feedback from Sunday morning on that particular topic. Let's just look at that word culture first to begin with. Kind of what is that word culture?
Yeah, so it's an interesting word, culture, because I think that we all experience it. We do. It is the water that we swim in, if you will. And I would also add that culture has a major effect on the way that you do everything you do, right? The expectations you have, the things that you assume are all wrapped up in the idea of culture. So we defined culture as the way things are done around here, wherever here is for you. Now, there's clearly we experience culture on multiple levels as human beings. So, for example, we live in Colorado, which is part of the United States. Within that, we live in Boulder and Weld County, some of our churches in Larimer County, this kind of tri-county area right here in kind of northern Colorado. It has its own distinct culture even within Colorado. So, there's these different layers of culture. There's American culture. Within that, Colorado has its own thing. Our counties have their own thing. Even our city has its own thing compared to other cities in our county, right? You go smaller, you could say, okay, even our neighborhood has a culture. Your family has a culture. Even your life individually has a culture. Obviously, a church has a culture. So every group of people has that. It's an interesting word, by the way, culture. I didn't get into this on Sunday, but the word culture refers to something that grows, right? So you can think about biology terms. If somebody has a petri dish, the thing that grows in the petri dish is called a culture. If you have yogurt or kefir or other things like this that has, we call them live cultures, which means there's something growing in your food, right? In your yogurt or whatever that might be.
Probiotics or something?
Probiotics, there you go.
Yeah.
And the idea there is that they're, positive bio ingredients, right? The things that are growing, right? So you can use a culture to create sourdough bread, for example, right? So it's a kind of thing that's takes on a life of its own. But I would say like culture, we talked about it's a combination of what you allow and what you create. But I would add to it that idea that culture is something that grows. What that means is that culture also takes on a life of its own. And as something that has a life of its own, it becomes a force which exerts influence on people. There are a lot of invisible forces in the world. There's gravity, etc. And you feel them even if you can't see them. And I'd say that's the thing about culture is that so you could call it at a very base level. You could call it's the vibe of a place, but that vibe has certain characteristics. And, it's been said a lot of times that people will often not necessarily remember what you say, but they will definitely remember the way that you made them feel. And culture is a part of that. Culture is a part of why you say what you say, why you don't say what you don't say. It's a part of how you make people feel and the vibe of the place. And so, yeah, it's kind of a hard to define thing, but it's one of those things where you experience it, you know that it exists. And then it gets to the question of like, can it be shaped? Can it be changed? And how does that process take place? So even the word that we use, cultivate, the word cultivate essentially means a farming or agricultural term. I mean, agriculture literally means growing something in a field. Ag is field, culture is growing, right? So cultivating means to create the environment in which something can grow. And we want to be thoughtful about how we cultivate that, both in, micro level, family, individual, church. And then how does that flow out from this place? And how do we also create things that can affect the culture, not just inside our space, but also outside? That's certainly what Christianity did in the early centuries, where they had truth and they championed that truth. That was part of their culture, but also part of their culture was living out those things, living out the love of God, the mission of God, the grace of God towards others, the welcome of God. And I think that that's really important to consider, right? That it wasn't just the truth that affected, it was how they internalized, how that truth shaped their culture, their community, and then how that had an effect on the community abroad. And we can see that it absolutely did, right? Western culture is shaped by Christianity, but think about that, just came from a nucleus that was fairly small, right? On the day of Pentecost, 120 believers in an upper room. Then you go to, by the end of the day, there were 3,000 believers. Now, those people coming into the church, and 3,000 is a lot more than 120. How do those 120 then create that culture in the 3,000? We talked about culture is what you allow and what you create. And so, yeah, we think about those things and how our culture of our church and how we can create things that do affect the culture abroad. But it begins with the nucleus that starts right here.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's just talk about, just so we want to be clear, we're talking about culture, but there's the culture of the churches you brought up, and there's the culture in which we live. And, maybe you can describe a little bit about that paradigm of how do we as a church, our culture, interact with the culture, at large, abroad. How do you think those two should interact, or how have they historically, or what is maybe the best ways for those two to interact?
Yeah, we've done a class here at church, and we'll do it again. It's called Christ and Culture, and it's based on a famous book called Christ and Culture, which, by the way, I mentioned in the sermon, the guy who wrote that book, I read his quote about what culture is, and then I kind of criticized it or critiqued it. But generally, that's a really good book in the sense of he gives not so much a prescription of what we should do, but he gives a description of how it's been handled historically in 5 different modes, models, paradigms, whatever you want to call them. And I think clearly he says there are 2 extremes of those 5s, which he would consider to be not faithful to the Bible. So you got 3 ways in the middle, which are 3 ways that Christians have faithfully and genuinely lived out gospel culture and in regard to the larger culture which they're a part of. And, so a lot of people say, how does our church deal with the culture abroad, and how are we changing the culture? And I would say, there's a lot of different approaches to that. One approach is to isolate and say, well, they do their thing, we do our thing. We're going to not care about what the culture does. We're just going to care about the culture of what's happening in these walls. Then there's another model that says, no, we're going to be primarily focused on like changing the culture out there. And then there's other models that are more like accommodating, right? And saying like, well, we are part of the community, so therefore we are not even going to try to change the culture out there. We're just going to, speak the gospel and all that. I'd say like clearly there's a way that incorporates all the best of those approaches. So for example, I think the primary way that we seek to affect the culture around us is by creating strong disciples of Jesus, right? People who are equipped. That's getting into our next series, Equipped to Serve. Equipped and ready to do ministry in the world, to follow Jesus, to live faithfully, which includes being on mission with God. So we want to do that in these walls, right? That's a big part of what we do with teaching. It's all about equipping for life and ministry and following Jesus in the world. But then also, we're on the radio, right? And so there you go, the word of God going out over the airwaves. And we're just hoping and praying that people turn the dial on their radio to the stations that are playing these things so they can hear the word of God, so it can affect them. Furthermore, we're putting stuff out online because we want to be kind of, if you will, a beacon that's creating and sending out stuff primarily, first of all, for our church community, but then into the world at large, right? Because we want to take every thought captive for Christ, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that definitely answers the question. And where would you? So you talk about our paradigm as far as we want to create as probably been representative of the movement that we're part of, the Calvary Chapel, is that healthy sheep multiply. And that's kind of where you think that's our focus. What do you think of some of the other ones as far as being effective? For those that kind of like, kind of what they would consider the seeker sensitive, those kind of movements over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Do those have any kind of effectiveness? Do you think?
Sure. And I would go back to like what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12 and 14, but primarily 12, where he talks about the church being a body. Now, I think that's true on the micro level, meaning every church is a body that has different members who have different roles and giftings and roles to play. But I think it's also true on the macro level when you go to the city or a country or the world, where there are different movements and different churches that emphasize one thing more than the other within the realm of faithful orthodoxy, and they have their part. We're not like in competition. We're not trying to drag them down so we can, stand on top of their fallen body or something like that. I would put it this way. Churches within that realm of faithful orthodoxy, they tend to focus, you can have what we call that, like a line, right?
Spectrum,
A spectrum.
Yeah.
Okay, so on the one end of the spectrum, you have those who are really focused on discipleship versus those who are really focused on evangelism. I would place us pretty solidly in the middle, personally. Maybe a little bit like a hair towards discipleship over evangelism, but we do, design our services, even we designed our space to be a welcoming space, and we seek to draw people in. So it definitely is that like come and see paradigm. And yet, once you're in the doors, our goal is to help you become a disciple of Jesus and go as deep as you're ready to go. Yeah, I think that, some lean really towards that evangelism method where they don't necessarily do discipleship in their church. Every service, everything that they do is designed not towards, helping you grow deeper, but really just kind of getting you to start following Jesus. I would say, yeah, there can be, so first of all, you can do both. You should be heavy on evangelism and heavy on discipleship. If you're going to lean one of the ways, I don't know. I think that different movements, and even within movements, even within our movement, right? There are some churches that are really heavy on the evangelism side and really heavy on the discipleship side. I think that we want to do both, but it's just a different paradigm.
Yeah, and it just kind of bring the whole question back, right to the beginning, full circle. I guess what you were talking about Sunday is that wherever you're on that spectrum, what is the culture that the people are walking into, right? So that's, are we bringing them into a culture that is reflecting the love of Christ, walking out the love, walking out the principles of the Bible? We're not just, bringing them into something. I think you talked about this a little bit on Sunday as well, that it's possible to have we could have a statement of faith and principles and things like that that our culture doesn't reflect.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, Francis Schaeffer, I mentioned him on Sunday, but he talked a lot about this. He called it the two orthodoxies in this way. He'd say there's orthodoxy of doctrine and orthodoxy of practice. But he said, look, if you're out of line or out of whack on one of those two, then you're actually not orthodox. So, I would say, again, different churches, movements, even within families or businesses or whatever, you can fall on one side of this. That's the grace and truth thing. That's why I want to be full of both grace and truth. But, I've certainly encountered it where you meet people who have great doctrine, and yet in practice, they really lack love and grace. On the other hand, I've met people who they're all about love and grace to the detriment of doctrine. And again, it's like the discipleship evangelism thing. It's not an either or. You don't got to choose one. The goal is to have them both in full force at all times. But you're right, though. The culture of that, where you lean in those areas, will affect the way that you talk. The words that you use, what you assume that people already know. These are all parts of culture.
Yeah. No, that's great. I think this is a great start to the year. Just that we start full of grace and truth. Let that be the foundation upon which, the truth of the gospel and being living out, the tenets of the gospel, being that face of Christ, the fragrance of Christ, as to whoever walks through our doors. I think it's a great place to start. And Pastor Nick just mentioned that we are starting a new series coming up. So our next Sermon Extra is going to focus on that. We're going to be looking at the pastoral epistles, beginning with 1 Timothy. And equipped for ministry, I guess, is going to be the title. And we're just excited to get into that. It's going to be kind of almost going to like a huge, conference, but the church is going to be there.
Yeah, like a ministry conference.
Ministry conference.
Common topic that's talked about at ministry conferences.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting about 1 Timothy, particularly amongst all the pastoral epistles, which of course are in the setting of training someone to be equipped to serve, 1 Timothy in particular is about what we've been talking about this past Sunday to start off the year. It's actually almost also an intro to our series, that good gospel doctrine should create good gospel culture.
Yeah. And there you go. So that's what we have to look forward to. I hope you're going to join us on that journey. It's going to be exciting as we head into this next year. And so, again, like, subscribe, download, do all those fun things, and we will see you next week. God bless.